ceasefire and the creation of a Palestinian state.
We cannot afford an Israeli attack on Rafah. It is certain to produce another humanitarian catastrophe. The situation is already unbearable for over 1 million people.
In public remarks, Biden initially described Israel's Operation Rafah as, quote, our operation.
Just military operation of Rafah, the major military operation of Rafah should not proceed without a credible plan for ensuring the safety and support of more than 1 million people sheltering there.
Jordan's King Abdullah condemned Israel's plan to attack Rafah and called for a ceasefire and the creation of a Palestinian state.
We cannot afford an Israeli attack on Rafah. It is certain to produce another humanitarian catastrophe. The situation is already unbearable for over 1 million people who have been pushed into Rafah since the war started. We cannot stand by and let this continue. We need a lasting ceasefire now. This war must end. 7 decades of occupation, death, and destruction have proven beyond any doubt that there can be no peace without a political horizon. Military and security solutions are not the answer. They can never bring peace. Civilians on both sides continue to pay for this protracted conflict with their lives.
We go now to Toronto, where we're joined by Dr. Yasser Khan. He's a Canadian ophthalmologist and eye surgeon who recently returned from a humanitarian surgical mission at the European Hospital in Khan Yunis in Gaza. Dr. Khan, welcome to Democracy Now! If you can describe what you saw there in Khan Yunis, the level of the injuries, how crowded the European hospital was, the threats people were facing there.
Thank you very much for having me. Well, you know, I look at the impending invasion of Rafah and the attacks of Rafah, and I know, because I've seen it, I know what's going to happen. I know the casualties, and I know how much worse it's going to get. When I was in Khan Yunis a few weeks ago, I've been to over 40 different countries, doing humanitarian work, anywhere from in Africa, Asia, and South America, and what I saw in Khan Yunis were the most horrific scenes in my entire life, and I hope I never see them again. It was just, the bombings were going on every few hours at that point in time. The Israeli forces were about 1 kilometer away, and the mass casualties kept on coming in. And it was mostly, the majority of the patients that I treated were children, anywhere from the age of 2 to 17. I saw horrific eye and facial injuries that I've never seen before. Eyes shattered in 2 6-year-old children with shrapnel that I had to take out. Eyes with shrapnel stuck inside, facial injuries. I saw orthopedic injuries where limbs just cut off and dangling. I saw abdominal injuries that were just horrific, and it was just mass chaos. There's children on the floor, unattended to, with head trauma, people suturing patients without anesthesia on the ground. It was just mass chaos and really horrific scenes. And I know that now, with the bombing going on in Rafah and scenes of children exploded, and half their bodies cut off and hanging on a wall because they've been exploded. Those are scenes going on now, so I know exactly what my colleagues are going through right now in Rafah and in Gaza, basically.
And doctor, you were working shifts of 12 to 13-hour days. Can you talk about the conditions of the medical staff and the doctors you worked alongside with? Where did you sleep? How were you able to eat? Can you talk about those conditions you faced?
Well, the doctors were amazing. The Palestinian doctors were amazing. Their dedication and their will to resist dying and staying alive was amazing. They're very talented, but they have nothing. There's no antibiotics. There's no painkillers. On the last day I was leaving, we ran out of morphine, which is very important in a lot of orthopedic injuries. So patients were, the whole European Gaza hospital was, at the time, now it's everything I'm seeing now, everything I saw is much worse now. But basically, it was overcrowded, about 400% over capacity. There's patients and bodies lying all over the hospital floor, inside and outside. They have orthopedic devices coming from their legs or their arms. They're getting infected. They're in pain because they're on the floor, so the conditions weren't very sterile. And if they survived amputation the first time, the infection would get them because then they'd have to be amputated after. A lot of the kids that I saw, and more than 60% of the patients I saw were children. They're thin. They had no fat on them. They're starving because, as you know, Israel has had a food blockade since this war on Gaza started, and so they're all thin with no fat, starving, and they're coming in, and it was just, we didn't have enough supplies, enough gauze, enough antibiotics, enough instruments. Even the instruments are rusting to kind of deal with the mass trauma.
Dr.
I
Hahn,
stayed in the hospital. Yeah.
Dr. Hahn, this is Democratic Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland speaking Monday ahead of a vote on the $95 billion aid package to Israel, Ukraine, and Taiwan.
Madam President, I want that to sink in. Kids in Gaza are now dying from the deliberate withholding of food. In addition to the horror of that news, one other thing is true. That is a war crime. It is a textbook war crime. And that makes those who orchestrate it war criminals.
That's Democratic Senator Chris Van Hollen on the floor of the U.S. Senate. Dr. Hahn, you're talking about the thinness of the children, of the whole population.
Yeah, well, Amy, it's from what I saw and what I experienced when I was on the ground speaking to officials, speaking to the doctors there, and this whole, one of the whole aspect of this war in Gaza, the genocidal intent of Israeli politicians, the Israeli army, has been clear. What is really bizarre is they haven't hid it. They have openly called for it. They've openly called for epidemics, and so as a healthcare professional, the attack on the healthcare system has been unprecedented. I mean, the viciousness of it, the killing machine that Israel has unleashed on the healthcare system, I think is unprecedented. Hospitals have been bombed. When the doctors have tried to repopulate them, they've been, sniper fire with drones has prevented them from going in. They've attacked the sewage system, the water system, so the sewage mixes with the drinking water, and you get diarrheal diseases, bacterial diseases. Cholera, typhoid is not far away. Hepatitis A is epidemic there now. They're living in cramped spaces. They have killed over 300 or 400 healthcare workers, doctors, nurses, paramedics, ambulances have been bombed. This has all been a systematic sort of, by destroying the healthcare system, you're contributing to the genocide. What's going on is now there's 10 to 15,000 bodies that are decomposing. So it's raining season right now in Gaza. So all the rainwater mixes with the decomposing bodies, and that bacteria mixes with the drinking water supply, and you get further disease. They have kidnapped about 45 doctors that have been specifically targeted. They've targeted specifically specialists who were, one-off. So like the one nephrologist in the Gaza Strip was targeted. The pathologists, hospital chiefs, and directors have all been targeted through drones or targeted missile strikes. And, so the whole thing is that if the bombings are not going to get you, then disease will surely get you, because they're all malnourished. So as you know, if you're malnourished, your immune system is weaker, so you're more susceptible to disease, but there's no antibiotics. The amount of amputations I saw, in children, for example, both arms, one arm, one leg, both eyes gone, both eyes amputated basically out of their eye socket. It's amazing. I mean, it takes about, if this was done properly in a non-war scenario, one amputation in a child will need about 9 to 12 surgeries by the time they're an adult, for prosthetic fitting and whatnot. Now in this case, first of all, it's a war situation. They've not been done properly. fair enough, because you have to rush it. But secondly, who's going to take care of these children, mostly children, because their parents are gone, their uncles are dead, their grandfathers and grandmothers are dead. And so, the Israeli killing machine has been vicious. I mean, they've used drones. When I was there, I was speaking to the doctors who were there, and they told me that they've used drones like the Hellfire drone, that is an explosive drone. It fires off these discs once it implodes or explodes, and these discs are very unique and they cause unique amputations. Most amputations occur at the weak points, like the elbow or the knee, but they cause mid-thigh, mid-arm amputations, which are much more complicated. And they fire off the shrapnel, and from what the doctors are telling me, that what I believe is that they're using weapons on the civilian population that have never been used before. Because from what I heard, based on my experience, Israel has a very strong defense industry, and buyers like weapons that are battle tested. So if you can put a label to a new weapon that's battle tested, that increases the value of it. And they're experimenting with these weapons from what I've heard and from what I saw in a civilian dense population. So it's just it's been vicious, really, really vicious.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Narmeen Sheikh. Israel is being accused of using starvation as a weapon of war in Gaza as Israeli forces continue to severely restrict the delivery of humanitarian aid, food, and medical supplies to millions inside the besieged territory after 4 months of indiscriminate bombardment and mass displacement. UN human rights experts warn Gaza's 2.3 million population is facing severe levels of hunger, with the risk of famine increasing daily. For more, we're joined by Alex Deval, Executive Director of the World Peace Foundation at Tufts University and author of Mass Starvation, The History and Future of Famine. His piece for The Guardian is headlined, "Unless Israel changes course, it could be legally culpable for mass starvation." Alex Deval, welcome to Democracy Now! Lay out the argument you have in your Guardian piece.
So my argument is essentially that while it may be possible to bomb a hospital by accident, it is not possible to create a famine by accident. And that for some months now, and particularly in mid-December, when the Famine Review Committee, which is the sort of the highest level of humanitarian assessment in the world, an independent, impartial, professional, and extremely discreet body of experts, said that Gaza is heading towards famine. It is already in catastrophe, and these are very technical terms. And unless there is an end to active hostilities by the Israeli authorities and army, and a full spectrum of relief operations, it is inevitable that sometime in the coming months, and they said beginning likely in early February, under the technical definitions, Gaza would be in famine. So that is fair warning, and the actions undertaken by the government of Israel, and the war crime of starvation is defined thus: using starvation of civilians as a method of warfare by depriving them of objects indispensable to their survival, including willfully impeding relief supplies. So the main element of the crime is destroying foodstuffs, hospitals, medical care, sanitation, shelter, etc. Unless that is all stopped, Gaza will be in famine.
And Alex, if you could clarify, we just have a minute. You say that Palestinian children in Gaza will die in the thousands, even if the barriers to aid are lifted today. Explain.
So a humanitarian crisis is like a speeding freight train. even if the driver puts on the brakes as hard as he possibly can, it will take many miles for that train to come to a stop. So the levels of malnutrition that we are now seeing, the exposure to infectious disease through polluted water, through overcrowding, and through lack of shelter, will mean that this humanitarian crisis continues. So this is not something that can be stopped overnight, and the fact that even after these warnings were issued, even after the International Court of Justice issued its provisional measures instructing Israel that it had to undertake these key actions, that this has continued, and the United States has not stopped it, makes them culpable for the crimes of starvation.
So, Alex Duval, if you could speak, you've worked obviously on the question of famine and of mass starvation in many other contexts. If you could put what's happening in Gaza in the broader context of what you've witnessed from Sudan to Ethiopia, Afghanistan, and Yemen.
I think the key element, key fact about what is happening in Gaza, has been happening for the last few months, is an exceptionally accelerated and concentrated and clearly deliberate, intentional reduction of a population to a state of outright starvation. Of a nature that we have not seen in modern times. There is no parallel to this since World War II. So if we compare what is happening in Gaza to other great famines in recent times, in Somalia, in Ethiopia, in Yemen, in the Nigerian civil war in the 1960s, in China, late 1950s, many of those were much bigger in terms of the numbers of people who died, because they impacted much larger populations. They were also much slower. They took many months or several years usually to unfold. They all have in common the fact that it is political or military decision that not only sets in motion starvation, but allows it to proceed without being halted. But this is an extraordinarily ruthless and concentrated example, as I said, without real parallel since World War II.
And could you explain why its intention doesn't really come into this? Why it doesn't matter whether Israel is deliberately using starvation as a weapon of war, or if it's a byproduct of its assault on Gaza? Why is that not relevant?
So let's look at the case that was presented to the International Court of Justice by South Africa recently. And that used the Genocide Convention. And the key provision in the Genocide Convention is Article 2C, which is deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Now, the court is going to take a long time to rule as to whether this is genocide or not, because the key element that it has to determine is genocidal intent. Now, there are a lot of senior government ministers in Israel who've made blatantly genocidal statements, but that does not in itself prove that there is genocidal intent in the way that the Israeli Defense Forces are conducting their operations. But the actual facts on the ground are that conditions of life that will bring about the physical destruction of a significant part of the population of Gaza, those are there. Those are actually existing, regardless of what is the intention. And there are different types of intention. So the war crime of starvation, which is the focus is on depriving civilians of objects indispensable to survival, which isn't just food, it's anything that is indispensable to survival. That can be deliberately intended in the sense that the criminal, the perpetrator, wants to starve, or obliquely intended in that the the perpetrator is conducting the actions for another reason, like crushing a military adversary, but it has that outcome. Now, the key thing about starvation is that it doesn't stop just because you stop doing your action. And it continues when you are being warned, and if you continue doing it even though you are warned of the outcome, you are also responsible. And that is the key here. The key is that Israel is knowingly creating these conditions because it has been warned and warned repeatedly, and yet it has continued. And so that makes it culpable. And regardless of the intent, the crime is being committed. And those who are arming Israel, supporting Israel, and undermining the relief capacity, which is particularly the UNRWA, are complicit in this.
Well, another point that you make in your Guardian piece, I'll just read a short sentence. You write, "Never before Gaza have today's humanitarian professionals seen such a high proportion of the population descend so rapidly towards catastrophe," you say. And this as residents in the northern Gaza, are reportedly eating grass and drinking polluted water. UNRWA, the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, said today a food convoy expected to move into northern Gaza was targeted by Israeli forces. So, Alex, if you could talk about that, and of course this coming as there are, you're warning of famine, these are the conditions on the ground, and donor countries are considering defunding UNRWA.
So, if we go back to what the Famine Relief Committee came up with back in December, and this was based on the data that they gathered primarily during the humanitarian truce at the end of November. They have a 5-point scale of food stress, going from phase 1, which is normal, phase 2, which is stressed, phase 3, crisis, phase 4, emergency. And in emergency, this is when children start to die in significant numbers, and phase 5, which is catastrophe or famine, depending on exactly how the different metrics and indicators work out. And the current, as of early December, was 17% in catastrophe phase 5, 42% in emergency phase 4. The projected, which was for this week, early February, was 26% in catastrophe or famine, and 53% in emergency. So 3/4 of the population in emergency or catastrophe or famine. And that is quite extraordinary, given that right at the beginning of the crisis, the population was under stress, but the rates of severe acute malnutrition were actually pretty low. The number of children who suffered from wasting because of deprivation of food was about 1% or thereabouts. So it's just to reiterate, this train of catastrophe is moving extremely fast. Now, there is a principle that was adopted by international humanitarians and by the United States government some 12, 13 years ago in Somalia, which is broadly called no regrets programming, which is that if you see a catastrophe unfolding, you must set aside the strict criteria in two regards. First of all, how closely and clearly do you actually know how bad it is? You should operate on a worst case assumption. It's better to waste some resources by feeding people who may not actually be starving to death. And secondly, you also need to work with authorities, or you have to have a humanitarian carve-out that means you can work alongside or with authorities that you don't fully trust, knowing that some of your aid may be diverted. In the case of Somalia in 2011, it was the terrorist group Al-Shabaab, because unless you worked with them, there was going to be a famine in the areas they controlled. And so it was agreed, we will have a humanitarian carve-out. Now, this no regrets principle is being inverted today in Gaza, in that the slightest suspicion that some members of UNRWA, which is the only capable relief organization able to deliver assistance at scale, the slightest suspicion that some of them, small number, are associated with Hamas and its actions is leading to a potential major cutoff in funding. And that it makes international donors doubly complicit in what is going on.
You also wrote in your piece, just to put what's happening in a comparative frame, you wrote, quote, "Many wars are starvation crime scenes. In Sudan and South Sudan, it's widespread looting by marauding militia. In Ethiopia's Tigray region, farms, factories, schools, and hospitals were vandalized and burned, far in excess of any military logic. In Yemen, most of the country was put under starvation blockade. In Syria, the regime besieged cities demanding they surrender or starve. The level of destruction of hospitals, water systems, and housing in Gaza, as well as restrictions on trade, employment, and aid, surpasses any of these cases," you write in your Guardian piece. So if you could elaborate on that.
So, what the Israeli Defense Forces are doing is not the full range of starvation crimes. For example, we don't see them pillaging, we don't see them stealing en masse. But what we do see is this relentless destruction of essential infrastructure. And this goes far beyond any proportionality. The laws of war are very clear that if you are conducting a war in an area that is inhabited by civilians, that you have to have the damage to civilians, the deaths of civilians, must be proportionate to your military objectives. And even the Israeli former Chief Justice, Aharon Barak, actually has said in a judgment, actually relating in this case to torture, that a law-abiding state or a democracy must, and I quote, "must sometimes fight with one hand tied behind its back," because the fact that there are combatants embedded within a civilian population does not mean that that civilian population loses its civilian character, its protected character, according to the war. And what we're seeing in the case of Gaza is that the Israelis are essentially treating the entire population as a combatant population. That is de facto what we are seeing, and we did not see that with this intensity in any of these other cases.
And Alex, if you could put this all in the context of ongoing U.S. support for Israel and also UK support, but principally US support, to the extent that Israel is guilty of creating the conditions for famine and already inducing mass starvation in Gaza, is the US also complicit?
I think morally, clearly it's complicit, and it could be legally liable in two ways. One, first of all, would be if the International Court of Justice does indeed find that Israel is responsible for genocide. And then the United States could be complicit in that crime in certainly the element of inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction. But even if the ICJ doesn't find that, or it takes a long time to find that, the International Criminal Court prosecutor is also looking into war crimes and crimes against humanity, which have essentially the same provision without the genocidal intent. And I think this would not be difficult to prove, that this
and faces a potential. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. We turn now to conditions in southern Gaza's Khan Yunis area, where displaced Palestinians who fled there to seek refuge are reporting heavy aerial and tank fire as Israel intensifies its ground offensive around two main hospitals there. We're joined in Chicago by Dr. Thayer Ahmed, an emergency room physician just back after spending 3 weeks in Gaza, volunteering at Al Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis, board member for Med Global, which has an office in Gaza, is working with the World Health Organization. Dr. Ahmed just returned to Chicago Thursday, where he's the global health director of his hospital, also an assistant professor of emergency medicine at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Dr. Ahmed, thank you so much for joining us. Tell us what you experienced in Khan Yunis at the hospital.
That has surgical capabilities. You have thousands of people sheltering inside of the hospital, families sheltering right around the hospital in the area of the medical complex. And what I saw was relentless bombing that was taking place day and night. You saw many people who were injured, many of whom were children, many of people who were just trying to go about their regular day, looking for where their next meal would come from, looking for where they could attain water. And in the process of doing so, they were hit by tank shells or by airstrikes or by sniper fire. It was really horrific and overwhelming. I mean, I work at a level 1 trauma center in Chicago, and the south side of Chicago is no stranger to trauma or to gang violence. This was something that was on a level that I don't think many people in America have ever experienced. Every aspect of life in Gaza has been affected, has been disrupted, has been made harder, and you really felt that while you were in the hospital. The physicians that I was working alongside have been working nonstop for nearly 4 months. They also are hungry. They also are concerned about where they can get clean water from. Their families have been displaced multiple times, and they're being asked to take care of waves and waves of people who are as victims of bomb strikes or tank shellings. You saw children walking around the complex barefoot. They looked like they were hungry, looking for food. They were trying to just find some sort of refuge. They're not going to school. They're not getting vaccinated. They're not going to their regular appointments. And what we saw on the nights when it was really intensifying is a mass migration of people. I remember looking outside of the hospital window and seeing a 4-year-old girl holding onto her pillow and her dad hurriedly trying to grab whatever he could, and they were going to flee on foot further south. Probably would have to walk 5 or 6 miles in the middle of the night, 3 or 4 a.m., as you heard F-16s above head and the relentless bombing taking place. And I thought, this can't be real. This is not something that I would expect in 2024, something to be happening. And I think that part of what we're seeing is, that these people are consistently being dehumanized and re-traumatized. So it's very simple to just say people are being asked to evacuate. People are being asked to go to a safer place. But what I realized very quickly, and what the doctors in Gaza told me, is that there is no place in Gaza that's safe. There's nowhere that you can take refuge. No place has been spared from bombing, and just because there might be an intense military campaign taking place in Khan Yunis like there was, it doesn't mean that Rafah, which is further south, would be any safer and wouldn't be subject to any sort of bombing, and that the people in the north of Gaza were also suffering immensely. I mean, I was there in the midst of a 8-day telecommunications blackout, and I remember the doctors there who were asked to work these 24-hour shifts, thinking about their families and not knowing what was going to take place, or not knowing if they were okay, not knowing if they had eaten for the day. And so that's something that I think was really traumatizing to experience secondhand, and I was only there for less than 3 weeks. This is what they've had to deal with for 4 months.
Reports are from the UN, at least 300 healthcare workers have been killed in Gaza. Also, Al Jazeera, speaking to a doctor at Nasser Hospital, where you were, Dr. Ahmed, in Khan Yunis, said 95% of staff fled to Rafah as Israeli forces, quote, bomb anything in front of them. So how many people are taking refuge in Nasser in addition to the wounded? How many dead bodies are piling up? And how many medical staff are left?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that was noticeably thinning every single day that the military assault was taking place in Khan Yunis, that more and more staff had to leave the hospital to go take care of their families and make sure their families were safe. You can say that there was probably 24 in terms of medical staff and doctors as well as nurses. I just want to point out that None of these physicians or nurses have been paid also for the last 4 months. They received one payment of $200 in November. They otherwise are volunteering essentially and just trying to serve their people. And in the process of that, as you mentioned, many of them have been subjected to violence, have been killed, many have been arrested as well. And so that was one of the concerns, that when we were in Khan Yunis and there was some serious, intense bombing taking place, is you saw that there was this sort of tension that existed. And I remember trying to say, I think the hospital should be safe. And they very quickly said, what would make you think that Al-Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis is any different than Shifa in Gaza City, or Al-Indonesi Hospital, or any of the other hospitals that have been attacked? What happens is, while these attacks are taking place, as you mentioned, people who have been killed, their bodies are left in the street, and it's very dangerous for any sort of first responder to be able to go and try to retrieve the body or to try to bring somebody who's wounded, so many people may die in the process. And so you see healthcare workers digging mass graves to be able to bury some of the wounded there. And there are thousands of people sheltering in the hospital. Amy, if you were to walk in Nasser Hospital, to go to any floor, you see people in every inch and every corner. They may have this small, thin mattress or a blanket over them, families congregating together because they assume that the hospital can be a sanctuary. And time again, that has been proven incorrect in Gaza. And so again, people have no choice. They have nowhere left to go. And the hospital staff are overworked. And I understand that there's this notion that, the people of Gaza are different, and I experienced it. They are so resilient, and they are so impressive from every single corners, or every single angle. They're able to do so much with so little resources, and they are phenomenal physicians and healthcare workers. But why are we insisting that we keep pushing them to their limit, to the maximum limit? Why do we keep trying to test their superhuman capabilities? That's something that I found really disturbing while I was there.
We are hearing such horror stories out of Gaza. How did you have the courage to go?
I think for me it was very personal. I'm a part of the Palestinian diaspora. I actually grew up in Chicago in an area called Little Palestine, or Bridgeview, Illinois. And so for us, when this war started, it was really, really tough to be able to sit at home and see the images coming out of Gaza. And I know that myself and many other Palestinian Americans wanted to do whatever we could. When the opportunity came about that Med Global, the organization that I work with, was going to be able to provide direct medical care to the people of Gaza, I could not turn away that opportunity. And I know many of my colleagues over there definitely thought that it would be important for someone to go out there and see what's happening on the ground and to be able to come back and share that experience.
Well, I wanted to get your response to this whole crisis around UNRWA right now. The decision by the United States and 12 other countries to suspend funding for UNRWA, that's the UN agency for Palestinian refugees, after Israel accused 12 employees of the agency of taking part in the Hamas attack on October 7th. UNRWA, one of the largest employers in Gaza, with a staff of over 13,000. Providing essential aid to most of Gaza's 2.3 million residents. The agency responding to Israel's allegations by firing 9 employees. Two of the employees are believed to be dead right now. Can you talk about what UNRWA does in Gaza and what it means to be defunded? The United States is the largest funder of UNRWA.
Yeah, this is a death sentence for Palestinians in Gaza. All 2 million are dependent on what UNRWA does. And UNRWA is a lifeline to the Palestinians in Gaza. Everything from shelter, schooling, water, health access points, food distribution. And UNRWA also played a pivotal role during this war. They were one of the few agencies that are on the ground that were able to give organizations like Med Global and other NGOs that want to be able to help. They were able to give facts that were on the ground. And when we arrived in Gaza, we found that most of the assessments were very accurate and helpful in figuring out how to deliver aid to the people of Gaza. Prior to any sort of war, UNRWA did this tremendous job of delivering aid to half of the population that was dependent on it. They were instrumental in being able to allow people to make sure that they didn't have food insecurity issues, to make sure that the water that they were drinking was relatively clean, to make sure that kids could go to school and that there were shelters in place. During the war, it became one of the only places that people whose homes have been destroyed or whose cities and neighborhoods were told to evacuate, that they could go to an UNRWA shelter without being turned away. If you go to Gaza right now, like I was in Khan Yunis, and I saw an UNRWA school that had been transformed into a shelter across the street from the hospital, what you saw is that it was packed with people, packed with families and children, people who were staying there, who were depending on the staff of UNRWA to be able to provide their daily meals. And I just cannot believe that this sort of response came so quickly. It's sort of sadistic in a way to punish the entire Palestinian population for what are serious allegations, but you're going to punish 2 million people, and you're doing it with the backdrop of bombs dropping over them, and you know that many people have fled and been displaced. And not to cut off this lifeline, I mean, I just find it unconscionable, and I cannot imagine that this is something that was taken so lightly. It's such a superficial understanding of what UNRWA does to be able to say we're going to just cut funding, and not also recognize the implications that it has on all of the population in Gaza right now.
You were in Gaza when the initial arguments were brought by South Africa against Israel in the International Court of Justice at The Hague, charging it with genocide, and with Israel's response saying that they were simply engaged in self-defense. What was the response on the ground of this groundbreaking South African case? How were Palestinians responding to this? And you just returned the day before the ICJ gave their preliminary findings, saying that Israel has to refrain from engaging in genocide.
You know, one of the first things that I recognized was that many people felt that the world was listening, and that there were some people in the world that were actually considering what was happening in Gaza. You have to understand, nobody has been untouched by this war. Every single family has been affected. Family members have been killed, homes have been destroyed, school is paused. Everybody is suffering in Gaza. Everybody is hungry. Everybody is looking where they can get clean water from. And so when they heard their arguments being made by South Africa to the ICJ, when they were hearing these things, I remember their responses where, you know, somebody is listening and somebody is saying what's inside all of us. Somebody is saying all of the grievances that we have, and they're saying it out loud, and they're saying it to the leaders of the world. And so there was this, there was this small reprieve in this really horrific war that's taken place. That, you know, maybe something good can come of this. And so I remember one of the physicians there talking about the fact that it's important for people to know that we're suffering, and thinking that most of the world was turning a blind eye to what was happening in Gaza. And this gave them a little hope that there were people who were going to advocate on their behalf.
Did you see Israeli ground troops? Did you see troops on the ground?
No, I didn't see any Israeli ground troops. What we did see, right outside the window of the room that I was staying in the hospital, I slept in the hospital in addition to working there, is you could see tanks less than 100 meters away from the window rolling through. In fact, I saw a direct line of them unearthing bodies from a graveyard that the tank was rolling over it. And you could feel the shelling with every single bomb that was being dropped by a plane, or the tank shells that were taking place, or even the gunfire. The windows would shake. And I remember putting up the mattresses that we had in our call room on the windows, because we were convinced that the window was going to break and that there was going to be shrapnel flying through. We had seen so many shrapnel injuries over the course of the 3 weeks that we were there. That was one of the main concerns that we had. So it was, I didn't see any ground troops, but I definitely felt that there was this tremendous amount of violence that was taking place, and everybody in the building felt so. There was a sense of pure panic amongst the staff, amongst the people sheltering there, especially in those 3 nights where you felt like there wasn't 2 minutes without a bomb going off, or you could hear gunfire. One of the emergency room department windows was shelled and broken. We saw several different bullets being fired and hitting the wall of the hospital. I remember trying to get service on my cell phone right outside the emergency department, and hearing a gunfire and just seeing it hit the wall of the hospital, and seeing some sort of dust emerge from that spot, and realizing, I mean, they couldn't be, these sort of clashes were taking place less than 50 meters, 1 block over from where the hospital was. In fact, a house right outside of where the medical complex is was bombed, and as many Palestinians will do, they'll go straight to where the bombing took place to see if they could find somebody, because they know ambulance services are so limited. And 5 minutes later, a bomb struck that exact house again, injuring many of the people who were trying to help rescue some of the people there. So it was pure pandemonium. It was incredibly terrorizing for the people that were there, sheltering in and around the hospital.
This is Mohammed Nasrallah, a displaced Palestinian speaking from the hospital you worked at. You volunteered at Nasser Hospital in Gaza.
We are suffering here. There's nothing available. No milk formula, food, or medication for children. The hospital is packed and there are no doctors to treat the patients. And even if medication was available, there are no doctors available.
So there we are looking at Mohammed Nasrallah. He is holding his toddler. We see the hallways are packed. Describe the scene for us and what kind of medication, what kind of nutrition do you have for patients? We're not talking about healthy people here.
You have nothing, Amy. I mean, you have nothing. What's happened in Gaza is, especially at Nasser Hospital, when it's like sole operating hospital in an area that there's an intense amount of bombing taking place, is you have to prioritize the people who are injured by these bomb strikes. You have people coming in who have shrapnel injuries, who are on the cusp of death, and you do everything that you can to try to stabilize them with a minimal amount of resources. I'm talking you don't have a catalog of antibiotics to choose from to protect them from the inevitable infection that they will develop as a result of these injuries. You don't have pain medicine to be able to give them to help them with their injuries. You don't have any sort of supplies, and you're relying purely on the amazing physicians that are there and their sort of creativity and ingenuity to stabilize these patients. But what you will see as soon as you walk out of what the resuscitation area is and you look at the rest of the emergency department or you look at the rest of the hospital is you will see sick people who are in agony, who are suffering, people who are having heart attacks, people who have uncontrolled diabetes, people who have had strokes, children who are suffering from upper respiratory infections or diarrheal illnesses, who are not getting the nutrition that they need, who are not getting the fluids that they need for the severe dehydration that they're having. I can't tell you how many people we saw succumb to these non-communicable diseases, succumb to these injuries that were not the result of a bomb or a war wound. All of these people who died, who otherwise, if things were just normal, if things were just pre-war, they would have easily survived these injuries. And it reminded me of this sort of concept of excess mortality that we would bring up during COVID. And it's when your health system is overwhelmed and you have a ton of people there, you really measure the effect of the tragedy by asking yourself, how many people, if we were not overwhelmed, how many people would not have died? And I can promise you that in the Gaza Strip, that number is astronomically and tragically high. Many people are dying because they are not able to access a hospital that has what it needs to treat them. Simple things, simple infections that would have been covered with an antibiotic, people are dying from them. People are showing up in a time where you could do something about it, and you have to send them home knowing that they will probably come back and that they will die from this. Children are suffering because of asthma attacks and pneumonia and all of these different infections that we just came from flu season here in the United States, and you know that they should not be struggling. And I remember there was an 8-month-old who developed bronchiolitis, which is an upper respiratory infection, and all it requires is monitoring and suctioning the mucus and really just sort of care that anybody can provide as long as you're given the resources to do so. And several days later, that child died. And you know, that's, to me, that's something that's really the unspoken story here. These are the people that are being neglected because of all of these airstrikes and the tank shelling that's taking place. And the healthcare system has totally collapsed, and the physicians have nothing to work with. And this sort of suffering is silent, and we're not able to really measure that in numbers because of everything that's taken place. And I think that's something that in the foreseeable future, once this war is over, and I hope that there is a ceasefire soon, and I hope that aid can enter unfiltered and unrestricted, and that people can get the reprieve that they need. But once all of that is over and we're assessing the scale of the humanitarian disaster and the humanitarian crisis that's taken place in Gaza, we're going to see that it's on levels that we were unable to even fathom in the midst of the war right now.
Can you describe pregnant women having babies in Gaza?
I can tell you a personal story of somebody that I was able to interact with who is a healthcare worker, who was pregnant. She knew that she was going to need a C-section. She went and had a C-section done, and it was an uncomplicated C-section. After 4 hours in recovery, she was asked to pack her things up, to get up and take the newborn baby and go home, because they needed to occupy that space with another pregnant patient who was in labor. There is no prenatal care, there is no postnatal care, there is no ability to be able to handle severe complications. We saw a rise in stillborn births, in miscarriages, in complications after pregnancy, in women who are suffering from bleeding after pregnancy. These are all things that that are taking place with pregnant patients who are having to endure labor in tents and in camps and have no ability to be able to travel at night because it's too dangerous, no sort of transportation to take them to a local hospital, and a severely limited amount of healthcare facilities that can accommodate obstetric patients or pregnant patients. It's unimaginable to have to think of what a pregnant woman has to go to, anticipating that they'll need to go into labor soon. But in those moments where they are able to have labor, that's not the end of the story. Where they are able to deliver a healthy baby, it's not the end of the story there. They are still very much in trouble in terms of being able to have the nutrients that they need to be able to feed their children and to feed themselves, to be able to take care of their children. It's staggering how many the lack of sort of capabilities that exist in the Gaza Strip right now as a result of this war for the over 50,000 pregnant women that are there. And it's very concerning to think about aid being restricted or not being able to deliver, especially if some of these neonates or these infants and newborn babies would need formula or they would need any sort of care. I mean, there are over 150 newborn babies in incubators in the Gaza Strip right now, and all of them are at risk because of the lack of electricity, the lack of the medications that are there.
According to UNICEF, a baby is born in Gaza every 10 minutes. Can you talk about why blackouts are a health issue, like the telecommunications blackouts, whether it's calling for an ambulance or people trapped under the rubble? Why cell phone service isn't about calling your friend to gab?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's such an important point. When we say that every single aspect of life in Gaza has been under attack and has been disrupted, telecommunications is a perfect example of that. The Israeli military has told the civilians in the Gaza Strip that they will designate these safe zones. If there is no cellular service, if there's no access to internet, how on earth is any single person in the Gaza Strip supposed to know where is somewhere that's safe? Are they supposed to just hope that they can hear it over an intercom that's being blasted from a tank? Or it's supposed to be a flyer that's dropped? They're supposed to be able to read that and understand that they can get themselves and their family to safety? In addition to that, what if somebody is injured or somebody needs to have some sort of care take place? There's no communication that can take place with the very few specialists that remain in the Gaza Strip. We cannot expect specialists like vascular surgeons that are in short supply, maybe there's 1 or 2 left in the Gaza Strip, to stay only at one place at all times. We want to be able to communicate with them, to be able to have them access and treat as many patients as possible in the Gaza Strip. If you go 8 days, like I did in the Gaza Strip without any telecommunications, how can physicians or healthcare workers or first responders or ambulance drivers communicate with each other and figure out how to safely deliver care or how to rescue somebody so that they can get timely care? You know, when it comes to trauma, there's this thing called the golden hour. And essentially, you have to take advantage of every single minute in the first moments after there is some sort of trauma that takes place, from a bomb blast or from an airstrike. And I can tell you, in the Gaza Strip, those delays are taking place because of things like a lack of telecommunications, by no area being safe enough to be able to transport an ambulance to pick somebody up. And I think, the second part of this that people should also understand is that there are several people who have been initially injured in Gaza. They have, their initial care was taken care of, but they need follow-up care. All of these amputees that you hear about, all of these wounds that have been suffered, they need really close follow-up and care. And some of them need to be transferred out of the Gaza Strip. That's not happening at all. And what happens to many of these people, many of them, is that they will suffer from a very slow and painful death, either from infection or some other injury resulted from this. And if they do not die and they're able to survive, like many of them will, many of the things that we could have done to help improve the quality of life, at that moment will have gone, and that they will be they will have some severe disabilities as a result of this for the rest of their lives. And so these are all ways that have contributed to the suffering of the Palestinian people in Gaza, and it's something that continues to this very moment, and it only intensifies with every passing day that goes by.
In November, Dr. Hammam Allo was killed when an Israeli artillery shell struck his wife's home. It killed him, his father, his father-in-law, his brother-in-law. He was a kidney specialist who worked at Al-Shifa, the largest hospital in Gaza. He was 36 years old, leaves behind his wife and 2 children, a 4- and 5-year-old. We spoke to Dr. Hammam Allo on October 31st in one of his last interviews.
And if I go, who treats my patients? We are not animals. We have the right to receive proper health care. We can't just leave. Do you think I went to medical school and for my postgraduate degrees for a total of 14 years, so I think only about my life and not my patients? I'm asking you, ma'am, do you think this is the reason I went to med school? To think only about my life? This is not the reason why I became a doctor.
That's Dr. Hammam Allo. We spoke to him October 31st. He died in an Israeli artillery strike, checking on his family 10 days later. Dr. Thayer Ahmed, talk about your colleagues in Gaza. You're just back from spending 3 weeks at Al-Nasser, at another hospital. This one's in Khan Yunis. Dr. Allo was at Al-Shifa. I mean, what he describes and why he says he went to medical school. He was responding to my question about why doesn't he just leave?
Yeah, he reminds me of every other healthcare worker in Gaza right now, many of the physicians. And I remember that interview, and I remember his tragic death, him being killed in an airstrike. I want to just mention that he's one of a few kidney specialists in all of Gaza. There are over 1,000 patients in Gaza that require dialysis because they have kidney failure. And in my first 2 days at Nasser Hospital, there was a 16-year-old who was on dialysis who ultimately died because he was not getting the amount of dialysis that he needed. And I can guarantee you that if Dr. Allo was still alive, that this patient would have been saved. What they've had to do in Gaza, especially when it comes to kidney patients, is they've had to decrease the amount of time that some of these kidney failure patients can get dialysis because they need to accommodate more and more people who have been displaced. And again, what happens is you have all of these very, very difficult diseases, these non-communicable diseases that get worse, and you have tragedies like this. I'm working with people in Gaza at Nasser Hospital who for 4 months, they have not had a paycheck. They also are looking for food distributions and for ways to get clean water for themselves and their families. Their families are living in tents or they're living in the hospital. They themselves are living in tents or they're living in the hospital. And we're asking them day in and day out to come in and treat many of the wounded. And this is not, a typical shift that you would have in the States or anywhere else where you are able to accommodate patients as they come in. There are waves and waves of trauma patients coming through that require intense care, that need absolute focus and all hands on deck. And we continue to see that we're pushing a lot of these physicians there to accommodate as many of them as possible with few resources, with no opportunity to be able to deliver the care that they want to deliver. So many of them were at different hospitals as well that came to Al-Nasser after those hospitals were raided or they were shut down. Many of them had been incarcerated they had been in prison for a couple of weeks and eventually let go. They are subject to just the same amount of tragedy and human suffering as the rest of Gaza, but still they show up to serve their people, and they do it in a heroic fashion, and they do it with such grace, and they are so skilled and so talented, and they have an incredible amount of knowledge and experience. But I am so concerned about what we keep asking them to do. And I think that the humanitarian community, and I think it's well acknowledged, is that we failed many of the healthcare workers and the humanitarian aid workers in the Gaza Strip. That we failed them, that over 4 months, we've not been able to provide any sort of relief that they are able to take a break from the constant trauma that they're seeing. And we're asking them to do so as if, this is a job that they're getting paid, or that their accommodations are taken care of, or that we can guarantee their security. But none of that is true. We can't guarantee the security of any healthcare worker in Gaza, let alone any person in Gaza. We can't guarantee the security of any child in Gaza. And so, I can't imagine what sort of person it takes to have the resilience that it does, but I met these people, and they are an absolute inspiration to the world about what it means to be a hero, an actual hero. And I'm just concerned that we keep asking them to keep doing more and more in a place where the healthcare system has collapsed, where all of the infrastructure that exists has been damaged or destroyed, and we're asking them to do the impossible, and we keep doing so every single day. I think one last thing I'd mention about the healthcare workers in Gaza is that I got a text message this morning on my way here to do the interview from one of the ER doctors that I was able to work with. He lives in Rafah, but he would commute to Khan Yunis every single day, and he was distraught. His name is Dr. Majdi. He was distraught at not being able to reach the hospital and deliver care to patients. And he was asking me to connect with any NGO that I could connect him with to see how he can still do his job, how he can still serve the people of Gaza. And that's the kind of people that we're talking about in terms of the healthcare workers that are there, or the humanitarian relief workers that are Palestinian, that are trying to serve their people in Gaza. They exhibit just exactly what Dr. Allah was saying. They're not going to desert their patients, and they know that it could cost them their life.
Dr. Ahmed, I'm wondering how you got into Gaza and how you got out. How many volunteers are coming in to help at the hospitals?
So what we were able to do, Med Global joined the WHO's emergency medical teams in order to get in and access Gaza and be deployed or tasked at different hospitals that had major needs. We were a group of 5 from Med Global, and a total of probably 20 or so NGO workers, medical professionals, aid workers that were able to access Gaza in January. We were probably the second or third delegation to enter. I would say that the end of December and the beginning of January is the first time NGO workers were really able to enter Gaza and be able to be tasked with ways that they could deliver care or they can deliver aid to people. It's nowhere near enough. I know that the needs are very, very high in Gaza. I was able to confirm them. That's what they've been communicating to us the entire time. There is a lot of restrictions that are in place that are preventing people from getting the aid that they need and the medical care that they need. And I'll give you one example. Many of the people in Gaza have been subject to these quadcopters, these kind of drones that are able to fire these bullets at them from the sky. And so many of them have been victims of this. And in fact, many young men I saw had these jaw injuries where their jaw was totally shattered. Well, you're able to do surgery and try to fix this, but you need plates or you need screws. And many of the surgeons that were there told us that has not been allowed since the war started, that they don't even have the materials that they need to be able to repair somebody's jaw. And I think most of us can understand that if your jaw is totally shattered, that compromises a lot of things that you'll be able to do to stay alive. That compromises your ability to be able to eat or drink any water. So small things like this, where you are sort of restricting any sort of screws entering to fix a hip fracture or a plate that you could fix, a broken bone or a broken vertebrae, they have very serious implications for the people there, and they could cost them their lives. And that's something that we're almost at 4 months of this war still has not entered. In addition to things like a portable refrigerator where we can keep vaccines, so we can vaccinate many of the children from measles or mumps or chickenpox, or store medicines that need to be refrigerated, maybe like insulin or any of these other medicines. All of these things are being restricted, and so it's been very, very difficult to be able to not only access and get inside of Gaza, but to bring many of the supplies that are needed. We know what the needs are. It's been communicated very clearly, and it's been very accurate, but there are multiple barriers in place that are preventing this and that continue to contribute to the suffering that's taking place.
What is the scene like at the crossings to get out? Did you go through Rafah, for example? We're hearing about people having to pay thousands of dollars thinking they'll be able to get out, but it's a scam.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's That's definitely true. We entered through Rafah crossing from the Egyptian side into Gaza. One thing you'll notice is if you're entering from Egypt into Gaza, it was not very busy. The other thing that you notice is that there are hundreds of aid trucks just waiting, parked at the border. And in speaking to people there, these trucks have been there for days. And you know that these trucks contain the aid that the people need to survive. We're talking about flour, you're talking about bottled water, you're talking about even tents or materials that they could use as a tent. And so that's the first thing that hits you. And the second you cross, once you see the Palestinian side, where Palestinians are trying to come in from Rafah into the Egyptian side, you see that it's crammed with people who are trying to be able to cross to safety or to get medical care. I spoke to several people, several physician colleagues or nurses who were also trying to get family members out. And they said that at that time, which was about 5 days ago, it would cost for each individual $10,000 to be able to get them out. And as you said, some of these are scams, some of it works, some of it doesn't, but Gaza is already a place that was very impoverished, and you're talking about people who have not been able to work for 4 months. Who has $10,000 lying around that they'd be able to get the life-saving care that they need, or that they would be able to go and seek refuge because there is no place left for them in Gaza that they'll be able to set up a tent, or they'll be able to stay with their family? And that's, I think, part of what's so tragic is hearing people have no option. So you're asking them to move, you want them to leave, but there are no real options. And that border is essentially for people crossing, everyday people to cross, it's closed. I mean, there are, on our way out, when we were leaving from Rafah into Egypt, I remember seeing that there were several ambulances ready, and there are over 50,000 wounded people in Gaza, thousands of whom need to be transferred outside of Gaza to other places so they can get specialty care. And I remember on the day that we left, that total number was 11 people. 11 people who are crossing out of Gaza into Egypt to get medical care. And I know that there are thousands and thousands waiting on the list. And there's a famous video that many people shared in Gaza with me about a man whose child was on this list, and he was ripping up the transfer paper because his son had died, waiting for him to be on that approved list to be transferred out. And I think that's something that is really hard to live with. It was hard to see. There's a tremendous amount of survivor's guilt that you have crossing over so easily, and knowing that there are people who are injured, who are suffering, who need to get specialty care, and who are just waiting for a list to pop up and have their name on it.
Who determines whether they can get out?
For speaking to everyone there, it seems like there's a list that's produced every single day by the Israelis that's passed to the Egyptians, and from the Egyptians it's passed to the Palestinians. And I think multiple people who are getting these sort of referrals, medical referrals, what they've had to do is go every single morning to the crossing, which is not easy. You have to understand there's no fuel in the Gaza Strip, so there's not modes of transportation that are cheap to be able to get to the border. And just find out if they're on that list in the morning. Every single day they're waiting to do so. And they're not doing so hoping that they can cross over and go on vacation. They're doing so because their life depends on it. They're doing so because a family member is extremely sick and needs to get the care. Or they're doing so because there is a chance that they could die if they're not able to cross over.
Dr. Ahmed, I wanted to ask you about dirty water, what this leads to when you don't have access to clean water. And also on the whole issue of infection. And so often I will see someone interviewed, and I'm not talking about, in Gaza, I'm not talking about U.S. television. And they're not talking about this particular issue, but the issue of famine. They're talking about another issue, but I see how thin they are, how their teeth are sticking out, their lips are receding. That issue of famine, and how that too, aside from famine being a threat to someone's life, leads to disease, breaking down your immune system.
These are really important points, and what we'll start with is the water aspect of this. Many people in Rafah, where there are now over 1.7 million people, what they depend on is a truck that's driving around that has a big barrel of water and that has a hose sticking out of it, so they can fill containers of water in it. That water, if it's tested, I really, really doubt that it is fit for human consumption. And what I mean by that is the salt levels in it may be high, or it may be contaminated with something that would suggest that it's not pure, clean drinking water. As a result of that, what will happen is you will have disease begin to spread for multiple reasons. Number one, if the water is not clean, it's contaminated, you can get diarrheal illnesses. And then if you don't have enough water to be able to have proper sanitation, that will run through many of these crowded shelters and crowded camps. And we've already seen a hepatitis A outbreak, we see many diarrheal diseases, and of course we see a lot of these respiratory infections spread through the camps because people have to walk 10 minutes or they have to wait on 30 minutes just to be able to wash their hands properly. And even if they wait that long and they show up to a sink in a shelter, or sometimes this is what would happen to us in the hospital, you turn on the faucet and there's no water coming out of it because the water has run out for the day, and you have to wait until tomorrow until you hope somebody delivers more water. These are very serious issues that will contribute to the spread of disease, and the World Health Organization has estimated that they believe more people will die from these sort of communicable diseases that are spread like this because of a lack of sanitation than people who have been killed in the war. And you know just as well as I do, we're already exceeding 30,000 people who have been killed in this war. To think that there could be more people die as a result of these diseases is something we know is preventable. And you're absolutely right when it comes to hunger. The food insecurity and the hunger levels are real. We experienced it there. We could tell that people are hungry. And every single person that we spoke to who would show me pictures of Gaza before the war and how beautiful it was and how the coastline looked, every single one of them looked like they had lost at least 15 to 20 pounds. And they are ready to admit that. Many of them are surviving off of cans of beans that they'll have. The World Food Program did an assessment back in November about how families were coping, and they found extreme coping mechanisms when it came to hunger. Adults skipping meals, sometimes for 24 hours at a time. Children having to eat less portions and less times during the day. These are things that are not just, we're not just talking about famine and food insecurity. This is a public health disaster. This is something that will cause people to not have strong immune systems, will stunt their growth, and will decrease their energy and their exhaustion levels. It will affect all parts of their life. I want to mention one thing about that assessment that the World Food Program did, and specifically for people in the north of Gaza. This is how extreme the situation has gotten. They asked adults in the household, how often did you skip food for an entire day during the last month? And they found that 90% of those households, those adults said, we did that more than 10 times in the month, where we did not have a single thing to eat for 24 hours. Everybody in Gaza is experiencing hunger. Nobody is spared from that. And every single person in Gaza is also looking for clean and reliable water. Even hospitals are not able to secure the right amount of water. I remember treating several patients and going to the faucet area, trying to wash my hands and realizing there's no water there, and having to use iodine or sanitizer or something that I wouldn't normally do here in the States, knowing that I have access to water. And that is not something that should be glossed over, because it has very serious health implications, and is something that, again, could cause and lead to death that should be, in almost every circumstance, preventable.
Which brings us back to UNRWA also. Any kind of large agency that spreads across Gaza that can deal with all of these issues that are across Gaza. Can you talk about how it links the hospitals, the schools, the clinics?
I mean, that's without organizations like UNRWA or other NGOs, if they are somehow, if they're also under attack, or if they are being compromised in their ability to deliver aid, if you put that in the context of what's happening in the war, where all of civil society has essentially fallen, all of the normal services that would be provided are no longer present, and now you're taking away the lifeline that's there, you're talking about total chaos in a situation that's already very chaotic and disastrous. All of these organizations try to work together to fill in the gaps, and they're not able to fill in these gaps. They're not able to address the food needs and the water needs, let alone the shelter needs. I mean, UNRWA has over 150 shelters with over 1 million people in them, and they are 4 times over capacity. In some cases, they're 7 times over capacity. What that means is that you don't have enough water to go around, you don't have enough toilets to go around for people to be able to appropriately use those facilities, you don't have a shower is out of the question. And you're compounding that with many of those facilities not just being said that the funding is going to be halted, but UNRWA can tell you about over 100 instances where their installations, their temporary and permanent shelters, were hit and attacked. There are over 300 people that were killed in these UNRWA shelters that were trying to seek shelter there. Over 150 of these UNRWA workers have been killed in the process. So on top of all of that sort of violence and the lack of security that exists there, we're now saying that this organization, which has been one of the main aid distributors, regardless of where the aid is coming from or what organization is providing the aid, UNRWA is one of the main ones that's able to get it distributed to people who are in need. Now we're suddenly saying that we may take this away, and we're going to take it away at a time where this humanitarian crisis has exponentially gotten worse because of how long it's lasted and how severe the restrictions are, and people have nowhere to go. I want to mention something about our organization. We work in several different areas. Med Global has worked in Ukraine, in Syria, in Yemen, in Sudan, in Colombia, at the south of our border here in the States, and we've seen really tragic humanitarian crises. Gaza, right now, in its current form, is the worst humanitarian crisis we have ever seen, just based on the things that I just mentioned. What we're saying is places like, or organizations like UNRWA, a UN agency that's providing relief for the worst humanitarian crisis we've ever seen, that may go away at the end of February. They've said that already they don't have enough funding to provide services in February to be able to meet all of the needs, and that's before any sort of pause in funding. If they run out of money in February, and come March, UNRWA was not able to deliver any sort of care, any sort of aid to the people that are in Gaza, I don't want to think about what Gaza would look like. I cannot imagine the hell that it would become if we basically cut off that lifeline.
Dr. Thayer Ahmed, you are an emergency room physician. You're just back from Gaza. You work with the World Health Organization. You're global health director of your hospital, assistant professor of emergency medicine at the University of Illinois, Chicago. What are you teaching your students? What are you telling your colleagues right now as you return?
Well, it feels really tough to say this out loud, but what I found is while we are trying to focus and highlight the humanitarian crisis that's taking place in Gaza, especially from an impartial, neutral, apolitical sort of perspective, I found that a lot of opportunities have been where I could educate people on what's happening, and we can start thinking about ways that we can contribute to alleviating the suffering. I found that a lot of opportunities have been stifled. I found that there has been a lot of politically charged discussions in regards to that, and that is an incredible disservice that I had never experienced before. I've been working in humanitarian relief since 2008, and I've never seen anything like this, where even trying to shed light on what's happening in Gaza is something that becomes some sort of political discussion or conversation.
Can you be more specific?
What I can tell you is that many organizations, specifically the Illinois College of Emergency Physicians, felt that it was not appropriate for us to call for healthcare worker protections. In May, I was able to go to Congress to advocate with the American College of Emergency Physicians, and we were able to go to offices and say we think healthcare workers should be a protected class in America, meaning that they should not be that any sort of assault that takes place on them should not be taken lightly, should be a federal offense for that matter. When I thought that we can draw parallels to what's happening in Gaza, and you mentioned how many healthcare workers have been killed, over 300 have been killed in Gaza, and I said, can we at least say that maybe healthcare workers should be protected, hospitals should not be a target? I was met with resistance to that, and I was met with talks about some sort of political discussion taking place, and terrorism and terrorist organizations, and for me, that derails the conversation in a way that doesn't allow you to take it a step further and really show the degree of the humanitarian catastrophe that's taken place. And so what I've had to do in the process is remind people first the facts on the ground and talk about Gaza before October 7th. We have to realize that Gaza was a place that had many struggles, and we know that it's over half of its population are children. And we know that the availability of essential medicines prior to October 7th was less than 90%, was less than 80%. It's around half of essential medicines for blood pressure medications or diabetes medications. This is all before the war. And so this is something that people need to understand. We hear from Oxfam that 95% of the water was not fit for human consumption before October 7th. What about right now when water is in scarce supply and you hear about people having to are trying to drink water from the sea? I try to remind people that Gaza was at a electricity deficit, that there were rolling blackouts. Well, now you're talking about 4 months with no electricity whatsoever, and how that would translate into daily life and how that affects people. So it's really about trying to educate people about Gaza before October 7th and allowing them to connect the dots, that what's happening right now is a recipe for disaster. It has been this incredible amount of human suffering that has taken place, and it's unfortunate that we have to start with trying to get people to understand that human beings are the people that occupy Gaza right now. The people that are living in Gaza are also human beings. This is what their struggles looked like before, and this is how these struggles have been compounded by what's taking place now.
We're talking with emergency room Dr. Thayer Ahmed, just back from Gaza. And before we go, I wanted to ask you about, well, you were born in Chicago, your parents born in the West Bank. Can you talk about the news from there and what you understand is happening with your family?
Yeah, I mean, I was able to speak with my family, especially when they heard I was going to the Gaza Strip. They were very concerned, but after coming back and just touching base with them, you know, the West Bank seems to be just as, I don't want to say just as, what I'd like to mention is that it sounds like there is a lot of instability going on in the West Bank, and I can only share with you what my family is sharing with me, and that's concerns about their safety of being able to go to work every single day because of increasing settler violence that's taking place, concerns about the ease of movement because of random checkpoints that are popping up and causing delays in them being able to go to school or delays in them being able to go to the market. Really, there's a significant amount of tension that everybody is feeling, and it feels like things are going to erupt and are heading down in a direction that's going to lead to total chaos. It's not the same as what's happening in Gaza. Of course, Gaza is this sort of pure military assault that's taking place by a very strong army, but there are raids that are being conducted every single day in the West Bank. It has been the deadliest year last year. 2023 was the deadliest year in over a decade in the West Bank. My cousin, who is a photographer, was shot in Ramallah while he was trying to take pictures of a protest that was taking place. He was shot by an Israeli soldier. Thankfully, he's doing okay and he's recovered. But that's sort of what they're being subjected to. And I know that it's not in the news cycle because of the devastation that's taken place in Gaza. But this is something that I also think is leading down a path of more violence, of more suffering, and I'm very concerned about where things are headed. I was just in the Ram, which is where my family is from, in August, and even then, moving around prior to October 7th was much more difficult than I ever remember it being, and the situation was already very tense with many of the military activities that were taking place in Jenin, in Tulkarem, in Riha, in Nablus. All of these Palestinian West Bank cities were subjected to lockdowns and military raids, and so it's a very uneasy feeling. Things are deteriorating in the West Bank, and it just seems like any sort of idea of home for Palestinians is being compromised every single day and is shrinking every single day. And so I think that's, of course, something that concerns all of us, everybody in the Palestinian diaspora and everybody in Palestine.
Dr. Thayer Ahmed, I want to thank you so much for being with us. Emergency room physician, spent 3 weeks in Gaza volunteering at Al Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis, board